Hello everyone! I'm here today with another Agatha Christie Golden Age mystery review, and this one's on Sad Cypress, the 22nd installment in the Hercule Poirot series, simply going off the Goodreads index, and published in 1940. I was a bit apprehensive going into this novel because the last Poirot novel I read, and the previous one in sequence, that is Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which I reviewed on this channel a few months ago, was one of my least favorites so far in the series, with exceptionally bland characters and a mystery that was just lackluster for me at best. Luckily, Agatha Christie is back on her A-game for this novel. It's a pleasant surprise of a Poirot novel, and that would have been true even if I hadn't been disappointed with her prior installment. It's continuously entertaining, and it now ranks among my favorites of her Poirot mysteries. I'm going to start with a spoiler-free section for the first half, and then let you know before I get into the spoilers for the second half in case you're not quite ready for those yet. This novel is a simpler, more conventional setting than some of the Poirot novels immediately preceding it, not including Hercule Poirot's Christmas. There are no trips to exotic archaeological sites here, no narrow escapes from boulders falling off of cliff tops. Sad Cypress in many ways falls right into the trope of the country house murder mystery. In fact, the conventionality of the overall concept, an apparent matter of inheritance, complete with a few hastily written wills, confused romances, and misplaced medicine containers, meant that if this novel was to make an impression and seem anything but formulaic, Agatha Christie was going to have to pull out something other than a vacation to an exotic locale to make it stick. And indeed, this novel is simple where it needs to be, and you know that the solution must not be anything too complicated. I mean this in a complimentary way, too. Christie here resists the common temptation for mystery writers to overcomplicate things with loads of wild side plots and game-changing but late-arriving pieces of evidence. That's not to say that the mystery is boring or predictable. In fact, I was already getting excited about it after a prologue that takes us right to the murder trial, which is then followed by the true beginning of the story that brings us back much earlier to an anonymous letter. This letter is received by our soon-to-be suspect, Eleanor Carlyle. It informs her quite directly that she's at risk of losing her inheritance and encourages her to go and visit her elderly aunt, Laura Wellman, to just check in on her, thereby kick-starting the story. For this same reason, we're well into the novel before the main murder actually occurs, but I never found myself really getting impatient or thinking too much about this. I'm not usually too impressed by Agatha Christie's character development, since many of her characters feel to me like cookie-cutter stereotypes that are there to fill a role in a mystery plot, but are pretty much unrelatable on any emotional level. So I'm going to give credit where credit is due. In this novel, Christie wrote characters that I found interesting through and through. Yes, they still fall into certain common stereotypes at times, and sure, they hardly rival the level of character depth we see in a Charles Dickens or a Jane Austen novel, but they're perfect characters within the context of this novel. The characters are all, well, almost all, likable and well-mannered on the surface in a way that makes us doubt any of them could be a murderer when the novel is starting. But of course, it doesn't take us too long to see the thinly concealed grudges and resentments that they have for one another. Thus, they come across as both likable and unlikable at the same time. I found myself suspecting that one character or another could be the murderer due to his or her flaws, yet at the same time kind of hoping not, because each character does have some redeeming qualities. Okay, actually there's one character who I didn't ever really like, but we'll get to that in the spoilery section. Also, in some of my less favorite Poirot novels, like I mentioned in my review of Hercule Poirot's Christmas, Christie continuously hits us over the head right from the beginning with characters acting incredibly suspicious, to an extent that we know it means nothing because she's just being too obvious. I enjoyed the style of Sad Cypress a lot more, though, because here Christie mostly avoids spoon-feeding it to us like that. We certainly can identify times where Christie intends for us to suspect a certain character, but it's at least something we have to think about. Like, we ourselves have to catch the character withholding key information, or we have to infer a concealed motive, as opposed to just reading a passage that says something like, "It was lucky that no one else was looking in Eleanor's direction as she picked up the loaded revolver from the table and concealed it in her handbag." You might say that last made-up example is way more egregious than anything we ever see, but actually, Agatha Christie, when she wants to, can really paint characters in the worst possible light. My point is, we see nothing so blatant in this book, which is great. The closest we get is a scene towards the early middle of the novel, and don't worry, this is not a spoiler, where she lets us see Eleanor's thoughts in a way that casts her pretty suspiciously. But this makes sense here because Eleanor is already the exception in this novel, the suspect who sticks out like a sore thumb and has all the evidence against her from the very beginning. This novel also stands out as the first of Christie's Poirot novels to feature courtroom setting, both beginning and concluding the story in a courtroom where Eleanor Carlyle stands on trial for murder. Opinions about this device here are mixed based on the reviews I browsed on Goodreads, but personally I really liked it. Maybe it seems like the setting would be boring and legalistic, but It's just not at all. It adds some good drama. That's all I've got for the spoiler-free section, so let's take a 5-second intermission before I continue to the spoilery part. Spoilers beginning here. One big question from the start of the book was whether to take Eleanor Carlisle seriously as a potential murderer. You could, of course, and it's kind of hard to avoid getting into a meta-level analysis about whether this would be a better overall mystery story if she is or if she isn't guilty. If we do that, I think the answer is probably that it'll be better if she's not guilty, unless there's some crazy twist like we've somehow become so convinced through the course of the novel that she's not guilty that she actually then is. This, though, just doesn't seem to be the way that it develops, because even by 2/3 of the way through the novel, we are still having a hard time totally clearing her from guilt. In my personal reading, though, I didn't rely too much on any of this metagaming of the novel. I basically just considered it a real possibility throughout that she could be guilty. Now, as we know, or are imminently about to know because this is the spoilery section of the video, Eleanor is innocent. From Agatha Christie's perspective as the writer, it's not good enough if she springs us on this at the very end with some late-breaking, exonerating evidence. She needs to keep us thinking from the very beginning along the following sort of train of thought. The obvious evidence is against Eleanor, but is there also other evidence? Are there also other more likely possibilities to consider that would remove her from suspicion? And along the same lines, does Eleanor have sufficient motive for committing this murder? This second point becomes more salient in the second half of the novel when we, along with Poirot, begin to doubt the presence of a clean motive for Eleanor to murder both her aunt and Mary Gerard. If she was going for the money that she received from her aunt's death, then she would have no reason to bump off Mary Gerard afterwards unless Mary somehow knew of her guilt, in which case it seems like this might have come out in the months between the two murders. If she was going for revenge on Mary, well, not only did I think it seemed kind of like a bogus logic that things would be any better if she killed Mary, in an incident where she clearly would have been under suspicion, no less, but also, why would she have killed her aunt beforehand then? Eleanor would have needed two different motives for these two murders, at least as far as we can tell. But for me, there was also another pretty convincing reason I thought Eleanor couldn't have killed Mary. If she actually planned for this second murder, then she planned it really badly. Killing her victim in the presence of exactly one witness when there's no one else around, the only way she could have expected to get off the hook for this was if she thought it would truly be considered an accident, or if she for some reason thought that Nurse Hopkins would be suspected instead, which I think would have required very wishful thinking on her part. Also, though, on the more personal or intuitive level, I know this can lead us astray in Christie novels, but I liked Eleanor. Yeah, she's insanely jealous of Mary, and she's pretty irritated with Roderick, as she well should be because he's a fool. But on character psychology alone, from what we saw as readers, she just didn't seem like the most murderous sort. Zooming out a little bit to the broader mystery plot, part of the success of this novel for me is that Christie exercises considerable constraint in the range of possibilities she opens up. Yeah, there are certainly still opportunities for crazy side theories, like what if Eleanor's sort of shady lawyer is the perpetrator, or what if it was the doctor? But these theories, if you could even dignify them by calling them theories, are nothing more than unfounded hunches, since we never see any evidence or motives here. The reality is that there just weren't that many possible suspects, so we didn't have to just throw up our hands in exasperation, saying it could be any of them. We actually had a fairly limited pool of potential killers to consider. But despite there being only a few mystery threads to follow, it was still tricky enough, or maybe I was just misled enough, that there were still plenty of reasonable possibilities to consider. Usually in a mystery novel, I can kind of list off a few working theories and tell you which ones are more or less likely. There may be some loopholes in even the better ones I have, but usually I at least have enough confirming evidence to justify thinking they're better. In this novel, though, at least for the first half, I found it really hard for a while to come up with any high-quality theories. It was much easier to come up with solid half-theories, in which lots of evidence supports the theory, like there's a clear motive, but then there's a glaring hole in the theory that seems impossible to get around, and therefore that theory just can't be considered seriously. In particular, I kept coming back to this slimeball Roderick and trying to pin the murders on him, as Agatha Christie almost definitely wanted me to. I mean, he obviously would have benefited from the murder of the elderly Mrs. Wellman, since he was to marry Eleanor and inherit the money. But then why would he have done this whole charade where he broke things off with Eleanor, fake fell in love with Mary Gerard, and went abroad to find himself, and then came back and murdered her and apologized to Eleanor? Or well, there's other options, but I'm going to talk about one of those in a minute too. Basically, I'm letting my dislike of the guy show here, though. It was especially clear after Poirot talked with Roddy that even if he wasn't madly in love with Eleanor, he cared about her too much to do something like this. So this is a pretty wild and half-baked theory if I ever saw one. So let's break things down now from the point of the second murder of Mary Gerard. As far as we know, there were just 3 people present. There was the victim Mary, there's Eleanor Carlisle, and there was Nurse Hopkins. For me, and I venture to say for most readers, this not only unsurprisingly casts suspicion on Eleanor, which we already knew about, but also on Nurse Hopkins. It almost seems too easy. But why would Nurse Hopkins actually be the murderer? What's her motive? We can't figure that out quite yet, and perhaps we're fooled by the seeming simplicity of the solution, so we start thinking about other things. What if someone slipped poison into the sandwich while the window was open? So we begin to wonder erroneously, as I certainly did, whether someone from the outside was involved. In fact, we might wonder, as I also certainly did, was Mary the intended target of the murder, or was it Eleanor? I seriously considered this possibility for a while, even before the characters actively began discussing it, as I'm sure Agatha Christie was hoping for us to. So in spite of there clearly being 2 prime suspects, that is Eleanor and Nurse Hopkins, because they were in the house at the time of the murder, it's hard to rule out other possibilities entirely. This does get to one aspect of the murder mystery that I find a bit unsatisfying, as did some critics at the time it was published. We see a case of mistaken identity, the legal technicality, where one character is not who she claims to be. Now, it works a little bit better for me in this novel than in some, because it's foreshadowed from the beginning that this is true. For example, we hear about questions of Mary Gerard's parentage, as well as rumors of her prior lover of Mrs. Laura Wellman's named Lewis, but we can't seem to figure out who he is. This was a little bit frustrating for me because I could tell that there was some missing information that was going to come out later and better explain the motives in terms of inheritances and parentage, but I didn't know exactly what that information might be. That said, though, even knowing this much should have probably been enough already to raise my suspicions of the servants, including the nurses, because it's much more likely that someone who's only worked at the house for a little while would be an imposter than someone like, say, Roddy Wellman, who would have had an exceedingly hard time being, not actually Roddy Wellman. I'm curious, though, were you able to unravel this false identity plot? Like, were you able to figure out what was going on before it was actually revealed, or did you just kind of have suspicions like I did? Leave me a comment if you have anything I missed. The method of poisoning itself is also a point of attention, since we don't know for sure whether the poison was placed in the sandwiches or the tea. If it was in the tea, though, it seems like it would have been hard to pull off, since both Mary and the nurse consumed the tea, and we're assured that it would have been impossible to poison just one of the 2. This led me to think of a few other parallels in mystery novels and adventure stories with dubious scientific merit by modern standards. I won't say the actual name of the stories I'm thinking of, but there are some plot points I have in mind involving, say, arsenic or iocane powder. So the solution, of course, does involve a way of consuming the poison and then escaping its effects, though you might say in a less elegant fashion than what I had in mind. I wasn't able to figure this all out myself. In fact, the very fact that it was morphine that was the poison led me away from this clue, because I thought, this isn't exactly a slow-acting poison or something you could easily build immunity to. I mean, I'm no medical expert, but I just thought it would have been pretty hard to ingest a usually lethal quantity of morphine and then to just walk away seemingly unfazed. But maybe if you're a chemistry buff or something, you might have actually been able to figure this out. I definitely would love to hear if anyone saw this part coming, because the technical aspects of poisoning and murder mysteries always kind of go over my head, even though they often work really well and are really clever. Alright, so in spite of these diversions and everything, was I on the right track? Well, about 2/3 of the way through the novel, I jotted down whom I suspected, and it was Nurse Hopkins. I didn't understand her motive yet, so I wouldn't say I was totally convinced of her guilt, but it was more than a hunch. There were too many suspicious circumstances involving her specifically. We had her lie about her lost morphine container, or we didn't know for sure at the time that it was a lie, but I thought it was weird that she'd be fairly conspicuous about losing what was to later become the murder weapon. Nurse Hopkins also suggested to both Eleanor and Mary Gerard that they write wills, which both of them did, and in my mind you've always got to pay attention to anyone who suggests to another character right before their unexpected death that they make out a will. And then there's this gossip between the nurses about a guy named Lewis, some letters that conveniently cross paths with the same information, making me wonder if one of these 2 had actually received the letter after all, and then just made up the other one to act as if this was new information to her, even though it wasn't. So although I couldn't tell exactly what was going on, it seemed like a case of making sure certain information would come to light by confiding it to a talkative and gossipy friend. I do have to admit there was one point in the last third of this novel, during the trial I think, where I momentarily started suspecting Roddy again. I think it was when we figured out that he lied about being out of the country. Did he come back, attempt to murder Eleanor by poisoning her sandwich, and and then by a huge mistake accidentally poison his object of admiration Mary instead. This theory seems at least consistent with all the physical evidence and facts that I can see here, and is probably the second best explanation of everything that happens. And don't forget that Eleanor had included Roddy as the main benefactor in her will, so Roddy would have gotten all the money following Eleanor's death. But it's less consistent with what we've seen of Roddy as a character and how he's reacted to events such as his breakup with Eleanor, the murder of Mary, the subsequent investigation. So no, I thought, if we're going to trust the psychological evidence, he's not a murderer, he's just a fool. Thus, I was not so much surprised as vindicated in this one to learn who the true murderer was, but it was every bit as satisfying as always. In terms of mystery plot development, I think this was among Christie's best, with only a few minor flaws to its detriment. And these were too small of flaws to spoil anything for me. And even aside from the mystery, it was a well-paced novel that kept me immersed in both the characters and the investigation throughout. What did you think, though? Where does this novel rank among Christie's mysteries? Did you find it as interesting as I did? Let me know in the comments, and I'm also going to link a few other YouTube videos of this book below that I enjoyed, just in case you're still itching for more discussion. Until next time, bye, and happy reading.